President John Hennessy, how wonderful to have you here.
Delighted to be here, Christian.
I'm excited to get the chance to talk to you about leadership because throughout the years and throughout our interactions, I've always had this remarkable sense of presence from you every time we've chatted, and it's especially remarkable given the level of the institutions that you've been at the helm of. And so I've always been very grateful for that, and I've always been very admiring of that. So it'd be a delight to unpack that a little bit. So why don't we get started with Knight-Hennessy and what's new in the Knight-Hennessy world?
Well, we continue to grow. We just this fall took our sixth class in, so we've now got between currently active scholars and those that have either graduated or are completing a longer degree. We're getting close to 500 people now. So,
Wow.
yeah, it's amazing. It's amazing the compounding effect of every time adding a class, and we've continued to expand the representation of students, both in terms of disciplines as well as where they're coming from and their background. So we're up in the range of 70 different countries,
Wow.
roughly almost 80 of the 120 degree programs across Stanford. So it's really grown in terms of what people are doing, and now we have some people who've graduated from the program, graduated from Stanford, and are out contributing to the world, and that's a really great thing to see.
That's fantastic. What are some of the most surprising disciplines and or perspectives that you've come across? I guess 6 years in now.
Well, we have a wide range of students, including students from we have some students from very small countries who come with a really unique experience. Whether it's a young woman interested in green and renewable energy and bioenergy, who comes from Kosovo, or a young man who comes from Tajikistan, who's worried about the course of democracy or the attempts to get democracy into Tajikistan. Um, we've had a young woman who had done some work in a school in Somaliland in Africa and came to a program here. And then when she graduated, they asked her to come back and run the school, be the principal, lead the
Whoa.
entire school. So she's busy doing that with her husband for a few years as a way of really making an investment. And the school focuses on science and math education for young women. So it has an opportunity to really make a big change in Africa.
Mm. That's beautiful. I mean, and it has to be so rewarding for you to engage in these conversations um, on the regular. And I wanted to ask you a bit more specifically, how does it feel to go back to the more in the trenches academia, academic research work, guiding research, coming from a place of administration and higher level management?
It feels great. I think the best title I ever got was professor, and that's the one I've always cherished. So I loved being president and leading the university as whether as dean or provost or president. But the true joy is being back with students again, and that's always been my life's work and the thing I've really um, not only enjoyed the most, but felt like I was making the biggest difference. Being president, leading a large institution, you have a you have a giant lever. You're really not directly the person causing change. You're not in the classroom
Hmm.
all the time. You're not in the research lab. But you're supporting and enabling the people who are in the research lab, who are doing the teaching, and the students who are there. And so, what you have to do, for me, I found that I had to enjoy the process of enabling others and find reward in that. But that's very different than teaching a class and doing something that's very hands on, sitting down with the student over lunch and talking about their
Hmm.
research and their trajectory. So they're rewarding in different ways.
And what was some of the growing pains or readjusting pains, if any, going back to like now you're doing your own thing as opposed to the
Yeah,
more
we're doing
yeah,
our own thing, but we were a startup. I mean, in the beginning,
that's
and
true.
we had lots of questions. Would students apply? Would we find really interesting students who were both academically capable of thriving at Stanford and who also we saw a dedication to a greater purpose, that they were going to live their life, a life that benefited others through any way they want. I mean, it could be they build a giant company and provide employment for lots of people. It could be they become a medical researcher and solve disease. It could be they go into government. It could be they lead a nonprofit. Several of our scholars have spun out nonprofits, for example, as the thing they want to focus on. So that was a question really early on, and we didn't know how to build a program that would complement the academic program that our
Mm.
scholars were going through. And the academic programs are extremely intensive, right? Being a graduate student is all consuming. So how do we build something that complemented that and really helped give them other skills and capabilities that they otherwise wouldn't get in their graduate program?
And what are some of those? I don't think I know exactly what the complimentary part. I mean, I just assumed it was a well endowed, scholarship, an exciting research project, and then you get all of Stanford. But I didn't know there was this extra component. What's that extra component?
Well, the first thing we do, all the first year scholars uh, take a once a week session on public speaking and impromptu public
Mm.
speaking. So it starts out with
Mm.
you get a prompt the week before, and you go in and you give a 2 minute speech on that, and you hone it to really try to have a great ending and a great start. And then you build over time to getting up in front of the entire room and being able to do that on something you're passionate about. Could be your research,
Hmm.
could be something you think needs fixing in the world, could be an experience you had that was really transformative. But we're trying to get them to think about how do they convey a vision, a passion for something in a concise and compelling fashion. Um, we do a lot of community building. All the first year scholars go on a retreat together. And that's
Mm.
really about building connections because a lot of what they're going to learn in Knight-Hennessy, they're going to learn from a fellow scholar. They're going to learn from somebody who's had a journey that's very different than their journey. What can they learn about the world, about culture? The other thing we discovered, and this we were not aware of when we started, the scholars want to run a lot of their own programs. So
Mm.
we have scholar designed programs that they run. They do one called everything is called KH. So it's KH
Mhm.
Geographic. Um, and what it is it happens about once a month, and it's a deep dive into two parts of the world. Two scholars get up and talk about their country and the culture, and normally we always have food available that
Of
that
course, yeah.
attracts people. But we get food from that part of the world as a way to do that. And they do an event called KH Deep Dive that somebody shares their personal journey and what they went through, and that's a scholar only event. There are none of the team is there, but they're comfortable then sharing with others what their experience is. And then we every year we do a opportunity to gather the scholars and work on collaborative projects together.
Mm.
So we just did a week ago, we did an ideas festival, and 30 some odd scholar teams get up and give a 2 minute pitch on their what they want to work on. And then they gather other scholars who can bring skills to it and things to work on it. And they're all over the map. They're pieces of
That's
science,
amazing.
medical innovations, social innovations. And then they work on them during the year together. And we give them a little bit of funding to get it started. But it's a way to really let them get some passion in the community on something they're really interested in, something they think could make an important change.
I mean, it just sounds incredible. I mean, the environment of academic curiosity driven toward making the world a better place that you've created sounds. I'm so happy for you, and I'm happy that this type of impact is going on. Um, Go back to Stanford, Stanford admin a little bit. How do you reason around the changes in the world and all these institutions facing these accelerating changes, whether it be because of AI, the general macro conditions, the accelerating, geopolitical uncertainty. how do big institutions like Stanford that typically have been paragons of truth and research and knowledge, how do institutions navigate those changes?
Well, I think it's become much more challenging. In fact, you didn't mention one of the other things that's really caused this change, which is the impact of social media. That is the
Yeah.
way Generation Z interacts. And
Hmm.
if you ask students, do they watch a news program? No. Where do they get their news? Social media of some sort, right? Well, of greatly varying quality. Um, and because of both its virality, right? People just repost things all the time. Its velocity, how quickly it can move through.
Hmm.
You're faced with a situation where rather than a reasoned, thoughtful discourse, you get a social media post, which is generally terse, generally isn't careful and nuanced about the choice of words, and can lead to situations where students or people within the university uh, appear, at least, or seem to have a much wider split difference in opinion than they did if they sat in the same room and discussed the topic together. And we really see this now with the conflict that's erupted in the Middle East, for sure,
Yeah.
all over our universities. And it's a time to kind of think about, what are the core values, which for the university, the importance of academic freedom and free speech is a core value. If you eliminate that, you're going to shut down ideas which are outside of the mainstay of what people believe in. So you've got to figure out how do you have that interaction, have a debate, but maintain respect and civility in that. And getting that right, I think, that's been a challenge that probably became much more abrupt in the last 20 years, but in the last few years has really become difficult. And whether it was
Hmm.
debates over the pandemic, over what's
Hmm.
happening currently in the Middle East crisis, or various things that occur, right? The affirmative action ruling by
Yeah.
the Supreme Court, the election of certain presidents, which caused a lot of consternation amongst students. Um, how we're going to navigate this, I think, is well, we're seeing it play out in real time. We're seeing universities
Hmm.
really try to grapple with it now and respond to it and remain places of education and learning and reasoned discourse.
Hmm. Yeah, I think a part of my project that I've been on lately is trying to understand exactly how information spreads. And it really does feel like there is an information vortex that closely maps all of the other vortices that are built on top of it. And it does feel that institutions have been faced with a challenge that they've never faced before in terms of adapting to the new way, to the new media, I guess. And not only institutions, you call them traditional institutions, but even the companies that are part of this process, right? Even the Facebooks, the Alphabets of the world, they've have had to reckon with the impacts of their products. And maybe that's a good chance to talk about Alphabet and some of the changes and or I guess the differences between leadership style and the uh, insider language between industry and academia. Um, is there anything there that you might want to talk about?
Well, I think there are both similarities and differences between universities and companies, um, but I think the kind of thing that binds them together is this notion that you both in both instances the leadership team has a set of stakeholders that they're responding to. In the case of the university, the stakeholders are the students, the faculty and staff, the alumni, the
Hmm.
federal government, because we are a large research institution that receives a lot of funding from the federal government. And they all form a set of stakeholders that are your constituency. In the corporate side, there's a different set of stakeholders. It's your shareholders, your customers, your employees. In the case of Alphabet, it's your users. So you have both
Hmm.
customers, advertisers, and users, both of whom are
Hmm.
vital to maintain the trust of both those groups. Just as in the university, you need the trust of the students and faculty to
Mm,
really to thrive as a leader.
mm,
Inside Alphabet, you need the trust of the user community. You need the trust of employees if they're going to contribute to continue to be a strong company. So the challenge in leadership, the hard thing I think is when the interests of these various groups don't align 100% on
mm,
various decisions, right? And it's not that they differ dramatically, but on one particular area, they may differ in how they think about it. Then how do you as a leader
mm,
come to the right decision about what the best overall strategy is? So I think this is one thing that really I had to grapple with at the university, and certainly Alphabet and Sundar grapple with every day in leading the company. Another important aspect is how you think about time horizon.
mm,
Universities tend to think with a long time horizon. Our research is aimed out 10, 20 years in the future. We're thinking about when we shape our students and educate them, we're thinking a lot about what they're going to be doing 20 years after they graduate.
mm,
And the alumni have an investment in the institution because that's where their degree is going to be from, and they're going to be thinking about that 20 or 30 years down the road. So we have a natural long term perspective. For companies, it's all over the map. In industry, it's
mm,
all over the map. Wall Street, in many cases, has forced companies to think about a very short
mm,
term horizon. They think about quarterly earnings and they drive the company. And if the company, does better than expected, they get a little bump in stock price. They do worse, they get clobbered. So there's a short term mentality, and this is one of the things that I so appreciate when Larry and Sergey set up Alphabet, that they basically said, we're long term investors, we're long term thinkers about the company. We will make decisions which, in the short term, may not look like the right decision, but will benefit the company over the longer period. And so we've made investments with that in mind. Certainly, when we bought YouTube,
mm,
for more than $1 billion at a time when they had not only did they have zero revenue, they didn't even really have a business model for how they were going to get any revenue. So it was a bet, but it was a bet because there was this notion, and I still remember Susan Wojcicki came in and said, video to this generation is what email and text was to our generation. And she was absolutely right. And the minute she said that,
100%.
you could see a vision of how this could be important. And the fact that we already had an infrastructure for using advertising as a revenue generation meant that we could see how to do this, purchase this company, and eventually turn it into a major player in the video space. But it's those kind of long term decisions. When we first made the decision to make a big investment in AI, that's now more than a decade ago.
Mm,
And it was obviously a long term investment to move AI kind of to the top of the stack as a fundamental technology that would underlie everything, how we choose ads, how we do search, how we
mm,
interact with users, how email. Well, one of the very first things it was valuable for was for doing spam detection.
mhm,
And so there was growing evidence of this, but it was a big jump to say, okay, our fundamental technology has become artificial intelligence, and we're going to invest big in the deep learning. And that was when we bought DeepMind, for example. So
mhm,
it's been an interesting journey, and it's been great to be able to take this long-term perspective
mm.
of how can the company continue to provide value for users and for advertisers as well.
Hmm. And even within just that response, there's so many changes that have occurred in the past 10 years. I remember when the YouTube acquisition happened, think it was something like $1.6 billion, and it
Yeah,
sounded like an insane number
it did
at the
sound like
time.
a lot then compared to
And
what Facebook
now
paid for WhatsApp. It's nothing.
it's nothing. It's like 1/10. And then you also see it how the impact that YouTube has had in in the current generation for sure. Even me personally, I mean, like there's so much material there, and it's really cool. Um, and then there's another story there, which is actually really interesting. Google has been an AI pioneer, 10 years. It's been the flagship item, and it was really interesting to see the spark that got ignited in Google over the past year with the release of ChatGPT, and feeling this sense of revitalization and all hands on deck. What was that moment like? What was that the change in catalyst in
Yeah,
the
we
zeitgeist?
were investing heavily. We had multiple large language models. In fact, the key technology that ChatGPT and all these large language models were initially built on was the transformer technology, and that's
Yeah.
a paper that a bunch of people at Google wrote about 7 or 8 years ago, probably. And that was the key. That was the key breakthrough. There obviously there's newer models coming along constantly. Um, our concern, we were concerned that while the technology had great promise, we were concerned about the tendency to hallucinate.
Mm.
And the problem with this hallucination problem is it not only does this model say something, but it says it with authority, as
Yeah,
if
it's
it's
so
really right.
convincing.
So I asked it at one point, write a 2 paragraph tribute to one of my academic colleagues, and it this is a person that happens to be born in Budapest and still has a Hungarian accent. And it, but he eventually went to graduate school at Yale. So it decided that he was born in New York City. And I don't know how it decided that, but I guess Yale is close to New York, and lots of Yale people are born in New York. So it just made that association. Uh, so we were concerned about that, and we were concerned about possible misuses and how to tame misuses, which I think the industry has still not grappled with.
Mm,
It's not that
hmm.
the tools are fundamentally broken, it's that because they are software pieces, they can be used for all kinds of purposes, including creating deep fakes, and I think we're gonna see, particularly as we get into election season, but probably in other places as well, bots using these large language
Mm,
models to create very convincing fakes, fake news,
mm,
and various other things, as well as video and photographic fakes. So I think we were thinking, how do we prevent this, or how do we put some brakes on it so it isn't as significant a problem as we were worried about. And then obviously OpenAI decided to put out ChatGPT, and all of a sudden the race is on.
yeah.
So it was an interesting lesson, and I think you're absolutely right. It fired up lots of people in the company and said, okay, let's figure out. We know how to build this technology. We've been building it for a while. Let's figure out how to get it out as a product.
Yeah, and it was really cool to see the galvanizing effect that it had. I think and Google had been, under Sundar had been subscribed to such thoughtful principles around
Yeah.
developing technology that I think, um, even in the case where they're accelerating the development, it's still grounded by these very thoughtful principles. So I'm excited to see how it all shakes out. There's another component to your involvement in industry, I guess in general, but definitely in Alphabet, that I think is exceptionally cool. That is, there's very few people who have visibility from the level of the computing architecture and all the layers of abstraction, whether it be software, hardware, technological, or it be organizational, performance review, org chart,
Mhm.
high level decision making. So, in the context of somebody who has that awareness of the entire tech stack of an organization like this, or Stanford applies the same way. How do you set up processes to synthesize the information so that the information that you get from your vantage point is the most relevant one for you, or is the most relevant set of information you need, and that it's vetted enough that you can rely on that information accurately.
It's a good question. I think, I think of decisions that need to get made and input I could supply kind of in two different piles. One is when it's something that's really core technology, right? So then it's
Mm,
really something that's in my area of expertise, which, as you said, is really computer architecture and the lower levels, at least, of the software stack. Um, and where I can have some influence, and I think, um, I think what's happened in the industry with GPUs and TPUs has been the route that we've had to go in order to deliver the kind of performance that these
mm,
deep learning algorithms, both learning and inference, require. Because
mhm,
inference, given that the amount of inference you're going to run might be a million times as many queries, so it's not each one is cheaper, but you've got to get the cost way down by comparison with the training cost. So thinking about how do you build these architectures that can do this efficiently, which really translates down to getting much higher energy efficiency in
mm,
these machines, and that means going to what we call now called domain specific architectures, things that are
mm,
tuned to do deep learning kinds of applications, which both GPUs and TPUs are now. So I can do a deep dive on that particular sector where I know
mm,
something about it, and I can get some technical understanding, and that can complement what other people, for example, on the board or the management team have. And then there's general strategic kinds of things. How does the company evolve its business? How do we think about capital allocation between
mm,
moonshots, investing in
mm,
core technologies, investing in AI as a foundational technology across the company? And that's a debate where I think as a board member we can bring some perspective. I also expect that the primary people who understand that problem and will grapple with it are the management team. So what the board can do is ask some wise questions. In fact, the best board members I've known
mm.
are the people that ask wise questions at the right time. So we try to be thoughtful and ask those kinds of questions.
And yeah, and it is kind of remarkable how on the consumer side, it's so easy to take for granted the we think of AI as an extension of software, but it really does require this reinventing of the entire hardware in order to deliver it at scale, in order to deliver it for free, like it's being delivered today, right?
Hmm.
Um, and I think this your answer also gets us back to the point of this presence that I've always noticed in you. I've always been incredibly amazed at your ability to be in the moment wherever you are, whether it's a situation like this one where we're having a one-on-one conversation, or I remember at Stanford you would do these freshman events and you would go to freshman dorms and hang out with freshmen for an evening and just chat about whatever the freshmen were thinking about. How do you find the either time or steadfastness in your prioritization to allocate time to to those things?
Well, I think you have to decide what's really important and what you want to do with your time. So I try to allocate it and also maintain sufficient free time that I can do some of the deep thinking. Because what tends to
Mm,
happen with very busy people, and this was certainly a problem when I was president of the university, you get overwhelmed by the crisis of the moment. So you're constantly firefighting these small
hmm
things rather than do the work that will prevent the catastrophic forest fire next time. So instead of doing that long-term work, you focus on all these little things. So I had to find ways to preserve some thinking time. And for when I was the president of the university, that would come over the 3-week Christmas break or over the summer
Right.
break, and that's the time I would really try to collect my thoughts, um, and prepare for something new, creating a new vision, thinking about something different that we needed to do. The rest of it, I think, is really just, as you said, trying to be in the moment. Um, Constant. I'm an intellectually curious person. So I'm curious about a lot of things, and so I read a lot, and I use that as input, so that I can carry on an intelligent conversation with somebody, even though I'm not nearly an expert in what their
Mhm.
field is. I can ask interesting questions that reflect some understanding of what they're doing and why it could really be important.
And I remember you, one of our interactions, you mentioned that you really enjoy reading biographies. What are some biographies that you've read as of late that you had particularly enjoyed?
I just finished Walter Isaacson's biography of Elon Musk,
Mm.
which I think Walter is amazing for capturing the kind of what makes somebody really unique. And he did this in the Jobs book, certainly in the book about Steve Jobs. But he does the same thing in Elon, and Elon's passion and drive and the fact that he can get along on virtually no sleep if he needs to. And if you're on his team, you better be able to get along on no
Yeah.
sleep as well. But he's not only is he willing to take incredible risks, but he's willing to drive people to do things that others think are impossible. And I think he's changed the. I mean, he really demonstrated you can make electric vehicles, and you could, with enough work and enough volume, get them to a really acceptable price point. So I thought that was really amazing story. I think, yeah,
And there's something there that I think is fascinating because I think Elon Musk has his first superpower was being able to leverage narrative of the changing of the times from fossil fuels to renewables, and he really was the person that said, like, I'm going to take this on my shoulders and we're going to build this together, and
yeah,
if it works.
yeah,
There's something there that is like the skill set of being an ambassador or embodying a vision of a better future. I think you exemplify this as well. I think, like, there's very few people who have fundraised as effectively as you have as Stanford. So how do you reason around that notion of embodying the vision behind an institution in order to capture people's financial interests?
yeah. You're absolutely right. It is about creating that vision. I mean, because if you take Tesla, Elon wasn't there with the founding group when they started the company. He came in later, but he really drove it. He drove them to he drove them really hard on, we're going to make this thing cost effective, because if all they had ever made was the Model S, they would have remained a small company stuck up in a very small sector. And what he had to do was to build out the rest of the industry. I mean, what they did with superchargers and charging stations
Mm.
was brilliant, because at that time, the availability of charging stations was a big hesitancy for potential buyers. So I think that kind of thing. It's a similar kind of thing when you're leading a university. You craft a vision of something the university could do, could address a problem in the world, could solve something, and then you look at that. That's built both on a need that exists in the world, but also built on a foundation of excellence and capability that the university has. And then you try to craft and explain to people why it can make a big difference. Um, and partly it's about being able to craft a vision, being able to tell a story
Hmm.
about what this could do and how it could be transformative. And that's the first step to getting people at least interested in doing something really phenomenal.
Hmm. There's another component there too that is it's not so, but I'm thinking of parallels between you and Elon Musk as well. So there's not just the ability to create a narrative and galvanize and mobilize people around a narrative. It is also, you were both in incredibly high pressure environments. Whether it be a capital intensive startup that is running an incredibly big bet and like is building out essentially supercharger infrastructure for the entire country, or an institution that is larger than the UN in terms of enterprise size, and you're fundraising from different institutionals. You're having dinner with different heads of state. I remember running into you in the quad with the Crown Prince of Norway, and just like a normal Thursday afternoon or something like that. Um, and how do you manage the pressure in such a high stakes environment?
Yeah, I mean, I think the pressure in a startup far exceeds in many ways the pressure in a university, because university isn't under the same time pressure typically that you are
Mm-hmm.
in a startup. And if you think about the pressure, let's say that Elon was under and SpaceX when their first three rocket ships blew up, and and he went to his buddies and got enough money for one more launch. But that was it. They were not going to, and it turned out that launch worked. So that kind of pressure, you don't quite have that the timeliness that exists in a
Mm-hmm.
startup kind of environment that you certainly have there. Um, Instead, you have a different kind of pressure. So one of the things you really begin to think about when you have an institution that's been there for 100 plus years is you're thinking, I want to make sure that 100 years from now, their the institution is still thriving, and they're saying, "Hey, that guy did a good job leading the university 100 years ago. Thank God he did these brilliant things that put us in a good position." You don't want people saying, "My God, he really screwed things up, and now we have to clean up the mess that they made." So there's a kind of longevity to the thought that's very different than what happens in a company.
Yeah, yeah.
Most CEOs aren't thinking 100 years out in terms of they're thinking 5 years out. They're long term thinkers. So I think that brings a different kind of pressure. It's not the time pressure, but it's the pressure of how do you think about what the right thing to do is, and what will be the right thing, not only for today's generation of faculty and students, but for a generation 50 years in the future.
Yeah, and there's another layer of difference too, that is like in an institution like Stanford, or even Alphabet. There's also internal pressure from people who have vested interest in the institution, who have been there. Some of them, around the same time as you, or comparable length of time. Um, how do you manage that part of leadership, of people who, so, not framing it in a competitive sense, but framing it in like, okay, how do we non-zero sum approach a problem whereby with this structure we can thrive?
Right. So I think there are two aspects to that. One is a relationship based on trust.
Mm,
So they have to believe that you, as the leader, are operating in the best interests of the entire institution. That
mm,
you've put together all the things, and you've made this decision X, which they may disagree with, and you have a rational reason why you made that decision. But there has to be a trust element that they believe you really did wrestle with the alternatives, and that you've chosen this because for the entire institution, the collection of constituencies, you believe that's the best choice. So that's the first part of that. I think the second part is you've got to you've got to make sure you adequately listen to what people think and view. So I would always say
mm,
our decision making is consultative, it is not consensus. If we
mm.
fall into consensus decision making, we'll be paralyzed because we'll never make decisions, because
Yeah.
there is always a group that opposes some aspect of some decision. Um, so we have to be consultative. People have to have the opportunity to make their viewpoint known, and we have to respect that. But then we have to make a decision and move forward. And that's one of the harder things to do in a university. We often become paralyzed when there's a disagreement between various groups, and also our training. If you think about our training, particularly as scientists, um, you basically don't write QED down until you know that it's QED, right? Until you know that it has been proven, right? Um,
Yeah.
so you, but the problem is in large institutions and certainly in startups, you do not have absolute certainty. You
Yeah.
rarely have absolute certainty, right? In a startup, you don't have it because, and you've got to worry about it because of time. Time is money in a startup, right? Elon doesn't get that fourth rocket launched and off the ground. He's not going to have SpaceX is not going to exist. In a university, um, there's a real advantage to being able to make a decision when it is not clear what exactly what's black and what's white, and there's
Mm,
gray tone in there. And that's because the university is so complicated that you won't always know. You're making a bet. Let's say you're hiring a cluster of new faculty in a new area. You're making a bet on
mm,
that area. It's not exactly
yeah.
clear how important that area will be, but you've got to have a sense of, I see something there. I see that it could be really transformative. It could be one of those big things that made a change. And I came to this insight at one point. I was talking to the deans, and we were talking about the beginning of Stanford's rise to preeminence among higher
Mm,
education institutions, which really began in the 1950s when Wally Sterling was president. And
mm,
somebody pointed out he made a number of very bold decisions. At that
mm.
time, the medical school was a teaching medical school up in San Francisco, and he
Huh.
moved it to campus and started the first basic research department in the medical school. And in fact, to show you how much disagreement there was, the project got named Wally's Folly. So
Whoa.
yeah. So people thought, you're crazy to do this. You're crazy to do this. So it turned out today, if you look at it, we're a medical research powerhouse and a clinical application, a clinical care powerhouse. So, and the decision to build Slack on the empty property of the university,
Mm,
which turned into be a generator for 6 Nobel Prizes, right? And so all these things were big decisions. The decision to grow science and engineering at a time after the
mm,
Second World War, when it became increasingly clear that technology was really going to have an important role in shaping the future. They were big decisions, and they altered the trajectory of the university. But they were bold. People thought, oh,
mm,
wow, what are we doing? In fact, when we built Slack and started the linear accelerator, it caused a split in the physics community, with people who believed it
mm.
was the right thing and people who believed it was the wrong thing. So I think those are tough decisions, and in retro, you can't always know that they're going to work out, but if they do work out, they're transformative.
And I think it goes to this notion that you alluded to earlier, that is, not being an expert in any one field, but knowing enough about the nexus that connects everything that you feel somewhat confident in these bets that you make. Right? I think, well, in hindsight, it makes it a lot easier knowing what happened. Right.
Right.
But there's another component there that you mentioned too. There's one world that is really easy to quantify, the science and engineering world. Like, you can actually sort of derive an economic prediction of the effects that some of these technologies or research developments are going to have. There's a whole other world that makes it's a lot harder: the humanities, the arts, the liberal, the liberal arts and whatnot. How do you balance that, where you have these two types of bets that seem incomparable?
Well, I think if you think about the challenges we face around the world, some of them are technology, but a lot of them are human existence, human condition,
Yeah.
issues of getting along with one another on the planet. And these are issues that speak deeply to the humanities and arts, and the social sciences as well, given that they study the human condition and how to think about it as a society. Um, so we need those pieces. We need those pieces. And if you think about any complex problem that we face, I think you're going to quickly understand that you need people in the social sciences, the humanities, and even the arts as well, because the arts give us the ability to bridge divides, to share insights across cultures and countries, and also to deal with ambiguity. When it comes to the
Hmm.
human condition, there is inevitably ambiguity. People see it different ways. And that's one of the things the arts are really good at, because you and I can be looking at a piece of art and see very different things in it. And that ability to convey emotion and say something about the world. Somebody was asking me recently about a piece of art that I thought really conveyed a deep human emotion or feeling, and I just said, Picasso's Guernica
Mm,
to me, is about the horror of war. I mean, and it
mhm,
conveys it very clearly, but in a way that's very different, right, than more traditional artwork done about war. So
mhm,
I think that that kind of insight, that kind of appeal to the human condition is absolutely vital, and it's one of the reasons that the arts and humanities remain a vital part of our education process.
mhm. And I commend you for being able to hold those two things in parallel. I think in the very left brain world, it becomes harder to justify some of these things. But I do agree with you 100%. If we were to actually quantify the economic value that certain pieces of art or literature have led to, they become pretty incalculable pretty quickly.
Mhm,
And like
mhm,
I think of one of the things that I've been thinking about recently is th- I've been thinking of value a lot. What value really is, and one of the ideas that struck me there was a copy of The Lord of the Rings will run you something like $15. But what is the value of a character like Frodo Baggins or Samwise
mhm.
Gamgee? And like seems to me that those happen to have a much larger value than whatever the $15 is for the whole story. Um, there's another subplot there that you mentioned about working with people and compromising on certain decisions that need to be made, and like making an executive decision and then making sure everybody's on the same page. That is um, delegating decision making power. So there's one thing for like this circle and the decisions we make together. There's the circles below too. How do you reason around entrusting people with
Mm,
decision
mm.
making power?
It's a really good question. I think people who start out in move into leadership positions often face this difficulty that they can't delegate because their view is, geez, if I had been in charge of that decision that I delegated, I could have done it better. Right? Okay. You're the person you delegated to got a B plus. You could have gotten an A. The false aspect of that, what's wrong about that is you didn't have the time to really make that decision well while you were also doing all your other tasks. So you have to be able to delegate, you have to be able to work together. So when I was serving as president, I made an important decision with the provost. I said, we're not going to duplicate one another's work. We're
Hmm.
going to divide things up. So you'll have the set of responsibilities. I'll have the set of responsibilities. We will coordinate. So on big decisions, we know that we're on the same page. And we would meet typically once or twice a week whenever I was in town, wasn't traveling, to try to make sure we did that. But otherwise, we delegate things and we try, except at various ceremonial events like commencement or something else, we'd say, either you're going to be at the event or I'm going to be at the event, but we're going to try not to have both of
Hmm.
us there as a way of leveling the playing field. And what I remind people of is that important leadership jobs are marathons. They are
Hmm.
not they are not 100-yard dashes. They are not to be done as sprints, because you want it to make a big change in an organization and really lead it through. You need to be there for an extended period of time and energetically engaged in it. And that means that you've got to be able to balance your work life. You've got to be able to delegate. You can't, nobody can work. I can work a lot of hours a week pretty consistently, but I can't, and I can occasionally do a 70 or 80-hour week, but I can't do a 70 or 80-hour week every single week. I'll just burn out. Plus, I'll have no time to do any creative thinking. So you've got to learn to delegate and live with it. And, you know, figuring out how to coach the people you're collaborating with, not micromanage them, but
Hmm.
coach them so that they, if they're stuck over something, they feel comfortable asking you, what do you think about this part of it? Or
Hmm.
how should I do this? Then that builds a good constructive relationship and it strengthens both individuals become better in their roles in that way.
Hmm. No, and you just inspired me a little with like the progression that relation has to take. So there's a progressive overload of the complexity of the decisions that you're able to delegate, right? Like I think um, And I think about this, for every high stakes position, that whose output is a few high level decisions. Um, as you start, reaching levels of abstractions where you're talking about vision and delegating execution, it really becomes like a matter of progressive trust overload. Um, and that is just fascinating. I want to change a little bit to the notion of leadership under crisis. You were at the helm of Stanford during the dot-com bubble during '08. You were sitting on the board of Alphabet during COVID. Um, what changes in a time of crisis?
Well, clearly figuring out how you're going to navigate that crisis, and each one of them is different in various ways. I think they have there's commonality in the need to make decisions under uncertainty. There's commonality in the need to calm the waters and send messages that are reassuring so people feel like their life is not going to end, that their career is going to go forward, and their education is going to continue. Those things really are important. And then you've got to be hands-on working with the team that's going to try to resolve the situation. And I think each one of these things reflected created a different kind of scenario or problem in that context, and required a different set of decisions. I mean, in some ways, while the 2008 financial crisis was difficult and hard, we were pretty certain we knew what to do. It was more a question of convincing the people inside the university that some tough financial steps needed to be taken, um, because we were certain we needed to do that. Otherwise, we were going to suffer the death by a thousand cuts as we made budget cut year after year after year after year. So we were fairly certain we needed to do that, but we had to convince people, and because some universities decided not to do it, then people would say,
Mhm.
oh, but XYZ isn't doing that. Why
Mhm.
are we doing that kind of budget cutting? Well, in retrospect, we ended up better than XYZ did because we adjusted our budget appropriately. But that was that stress. I think the pandemic was created a different kind of problem because there was a lot of uncertainty. And
Mm.
when we first shut down, I think
Yeah.
we all expected we'll be back in a few weeks. We're back summertime, and it'll be a slower period, but it will be everybody will be back. Well, that was wrong. And then as it went on, I think there was a lot of uncertainty. People were obviously worried about their jobs. Were they still going to have a
Mm.
job? Was the company, in the case of Alphabet, were they going to stand by their employees? How long could they afford to stand by them? Same thing in the
Mm.
university. There were a lot of people who basically did not have a lot of work to do, given that the
Mm.
students were not on campus. And how long could we preserve their jobs and hold on to them, um, and really make it work? The funny thing about the whole pandemic is that once the initial shock was hit the economic system, the rebound was quite quick.
Yeah.
So financially, that was not as financially in the end. The 2008 financial crisis was a much bigger hit on the university's
100%.
finance than the pandemic. So that was an interesting lesson for us. But the pandemic, it was just, what are you going to do? You're a residential university, and all of a sudden there are no students there. So that was a tough thing to navigate. And same thing at Google. And how do we resume work, and how do we get people reengaged? And particularly for Google, which is a very collaborative company where there's lots of it's not engineers sitting in cubicles with bags over their heads. It's a highly collaborative environment where people collaborate to build great things. And how to do that, luckily, I think relationships had been built before we moved to Zoom, and you
Mm.
could carry on that. It wasn't perhaps ideal, especially meetings were not
Oh yeah.
great on
Oh
Zoom.
yeah.
One on one, it's not so bad, but meetings are something else. But I think we navigated through that in a reasonable way, and we came out okay. I wish we had known everything about how long it was going to last at the beginning, because we would have then made different decisions probably.
Hmm. And then there's the flip side of that, which is so there's navigating unexpected obstacles. There's also seizing and leaping at the opportunity of exciting possibilities. And I think,
Yep.
recently I've been thinking more about this lately. Like, how do you know when to jump at something?
Well, it's somewhat gut instinct. I tend to look at a hierarchy of things. First of all, if we jump at this, will it make a big difference? Will it make a big difference in the world? Secondly, do we have the resources, and is this an appropriate use of the resources in terms of looking at opportunity cost? What else could we do? Um, and third, do we have a starting platform that we can really build on? People, talent,
Mm,
whatever. Do we have something we can start so that if we go in this direction, we're not starting at ground zero? We have a leg up. We have something to build on. We hopefully have some leadership who can help us make that transition. But I think you look at all those things. You try to in the university. I try to look at, okay, tell me who's got this really great idea, and
mm,
how many of their colleagues are also energized by this idea. Because when I see a
mm,
really smart group of faculty together that believe we ought to go do X, that's a pretty convincing story for me. So I think those things, and the same thing inside Google, you'd find a group of
mm.
leaders and the technical leaders in the company, come in and say, "This is the AI is the future, guys. This technology is really transformative, and this is not another." I mean, for AI, it was an interesting bet because there'd been this series of so-called AI winters where
Yeah.
over probably 50 years, AI had underperformed constantly in terms
Hmm.
of its accomplishments. And then all of a sudden, um, the image recognition CNN paper, the AlphaGo
Mm,
result, all of a sudden,
yeah.
boom, this technology breaks through, and then 10 years later we're looking at these large language models. So I think this kind of transformation can happen, and seeing when it's taking off, that 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 it's a bet, obviously, but you're
Yeah.
trying to you're trying to get a gut instinct of, is this the time it's really going to happen?
And just, I mean, I just want to echo the track record that you have in getting those bets right, even in terms of like building out the TPU infrastructure and like across data center. These are gigantic bets that are incredibly difficult to deploy at scale. And then the results speak for themselves. Like I think the world is now faced with a new type of thing, new type of product experience, new type of relationship to the internet and each other, and it's all thanks to these bets that sort of, a
Yeah.
lot of green lights, definitely, but
Yeah, and sometimes you just see them. I mean, for me, the thing that convinced me the web was going to change the entire world was going over and seeing a demo of Yahoo that Jerry Yang and Dave Filo had built at Stanford. And this was before it was a company; it was just an internal project that they were working on in their spare time. And they showed me a demo, and they showed me how the Oracle, how the web worked, and how the portal worked. And they showed me that their favorite pizza place now allowed you to order on the World
Mm,
Wide Web. And it was the first time I saw anybody doing a business transaction on the web and using it as an advertising way to attract customers. And I immediately realized the web is going to change the way we do lots of things. And surely that's what happened. But it was that insight of seeing that. I mean, and I sometimes say, one of the advantages that you have at a university is you're in a crow's nest. You're up high on the mast. You get to see
mm.
really interesting things happen, and you get to see them before they become mainline events. And that's exactly what happened then. And I saw it, and I said, the world is going to change.
Wow.
And it wasn't
Um,
just prior to that. The interesting thing about the web, if you look at the origin of the web, it was at CERN, and the primary users on campus were people at Slack who were exchanging scientific data and research papers. And that was the
yeah.
original thing: is people could put their research papers up and get them over the net. Well, that was fine. That is a good use of the web. But there was this whole other explosion of commercial use of the web
Mm.
that was about to happen.
No, and it transformed the nature of society, really, truly.
Absolutely.
Um, there's one final personal question that is, how do you? So I've been trying to analyze the commonalities between people who I get the impression have found their thing. An example: Roger Federer was always meant to play tennis. You know, I think you were always meant to be president of Stanford and lead the institutions that you ran. How does, for anybody who might be listening, how does one approach the problem of or the beautiful challenge of finding what you're meant to do?
Mm. So I think the key is finding that intersection in a Venn diagram where one circle is things that you're good at, that you are innately or from your education you've built up ability at it. So I think like a computer scientist. I think
Mm-hmm.
algorithmically. And so that really, for my scholarly career, that was a kind of building block for me. And then, what do you really love doing? And I love learning new things. I'm intellectually curious, as I said. I love learning new things. I love constantly being exposed to new things. So those two things intersect in a way in a kind of academic scholarly career, which was right for me. I never thought I'd be university president. I loved being
Hmm.
an ordinary professor. Um, and I discovered along the way, starting with small leadership jobs, that I enjoyed that process of leading, of helping make students and faculty successful in their research and education endeavors. And as I discovered that, I one step at a time took a slightly bigger leadership position until I ended up as president. But it's a bit of a frog in the pot of water that's getting hotter, and the frog is starting to
Hmm.
cook before the frog realizes they're cooking. And I wouldn't have changed it. I wouldn't have changed it. But I think it was a good way to grow into that kind of opportunity.
Hmm. And I guess this leads to my last question, which is, um, so when I joined Stanford as a freshman, there was a campaign that said "Leave your legacy," and one of the things that was advertised was Stanford as a malleable place that you as a student could, be a citizen of and leave your imprint on. Um, and we graduated at the same time from Stanford. I think you're my classmate because I graduated in 2016, and you left your legacy quite literally on it with the Knight-Hennessy Scholarship. And I was wondering how you thought, okay, this is my legacy.
Mm,
How do you arrive
mm,
at that?
yeah. Well, when I decided to step down as president, as you pointed out, I had been doing it for 16 years. It seemed like a good time for a change. And I felt it was time for someone else to come in and lead the institution. And that I had done that bit. I had 16 years as president, and then years as provost and dean was 20 years in academic administration. So that seemed like long enough, but I still felt like I felt like I wasn't ready to retire. I really didn't want to go back to. I could have gone back to my research career, but because I'm an experimental computer scientist, it would have taken me 5 years just to rebuild up a lab and get it going again. So that didn't seem like the best use of my time. So I started thinking about what could we do that could really make a difference? And I looked at various other programs that have helped develop important leaders around the world, whether it's Rhodes or Marshall or
Mm,
Gates Cambridge, and said, this is strange. We have all these programs, but they're in Europe. They're in England, the
mm,
old country. Why isn't there one in the US? And if it's going to be in the US, why not be in the center of innovation and entrepreneurial thinking and pioneering, a university which really thinks of itself as a pioneering institution? And so that struck me as really uh, good insight. And I developed the idea with the deans and developed it with the trustees, and there was enormous enthusiasm for it, and so I knew that people really thought it could be a game changer. So, and since I'm a lifelong educator,
mm.
doing something in education made obvious sense for me.
I mean, it's so great, and I mean, it's wonderful to see the full circle aspect of it. You know, of starting as a professor, going all the way to the top, and then coming back to you know home base and hitting the home
Yeah.
run. Um, President Hennessy, thank you so much for your time. This was
Thank you,
incredible. I'm
Christian.
really grateful.
I enjoyed it.
All right, I'll see you soon.
Okay.